Welcome back, fellow armchair generals. This is Gamer1745 here with my continuing playthrough of Hearts of Iron 3 with Black Ice 9.11, and of course we are playing as Japan. So let's continue this. Okay, Bulgaria. We give them money for metal. No thank you. I think once our shipping lanes activate, we will have enough coming in. Like I say, we'll have enough. Might not have enough oil though. Why are we hitting so bad with oil right now? Did one of our trade things go off? Germany, money for metal. No, we don't need metal. Okay, oh well, now we're up there. Okay. That's good. Okay, small arms have advanced. Talked a fair amount about small arms, I'm sure. Trying to think, the original development of the oh man, I just man, this is making me look bad. The I'm keep wanting to say Ascari, but it's the Arisaka. Yeah, I know what I'm talking about. It just the Arisaka, and really it's only the first model should be called the Arisaka. It's more us collectors in the West continuing calling them. I think the proper World War II, if I'm not mistaken, is a Type 99. They were an acceptable bolt action rifle. I have one that is fairly well, not sure when it was made, but it wasn't one of the late war last ditch rifles. It's in fairly good shape, you know, meaning the machining on it, all the little bits and pieces are all done really nicely. So it's sort of the proper stuff, and it's I believe a war bring back because it doesn't have a defaced mon whatever, the chrysanthemum, which is sort of the emperor's symbol. And I know many of those that were at one point or another turned over as surrender things to the occupying allies at the end of the war were defaced. I know that. Now, I don't know if that's 99% of them or 10% of them. Now, 10% can be many thousands of rifles, you know, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands even, you know. So I do know they did deface lots of them, and there was definitely a, whether it was an official order at some level or just a general, this is something we're going to do. I don't know for sure, because we see surrender. I've seen photos of surrender ceremonies of, say, like the Japanese surrendering to the British, sort of basically at the end of the war when they're retaking back Singapore and piling up large amounts of these rifles, as well as laying out in neat rows their samurai swords. You know, the officers were doing, and these samurai swords weren't. Well, some of them may be, I just looking at them, you know, on the photograph long distance, I have no idea whether these are sort of modern samurai swords or family heirlooms in modern dressings, military dressings. You could bring your own blade, but basically you had to put, you know, in the standard scabbard and the standard, you know, hilt. I'm sure there were special people that might have gotten away with other things, but generally you put it in the standard stuff. But you could bring your family blade if you wanted to. I have no idea, because you're looking at closed blades lined up there, you know, meaning in the scabbards, so that they were surrendering this stuff. And I have no idea whether the the Singapore garrison before, and literally just heaped piles of stacks of arms laid down by like soldiers, I guess, walking by, laying them down one at a time. Whether all those the chrysanthemums were disfigured or not, I have no idea. As opposed to, say, what may have also happened is the U.S. or somebody else showing up, and there's the barracks and there's the armory next to the barracks, and all of the rifles are in their rifle racks. Now, of course, they could have all. Doesn't take a lot of effort, but you have to have a file or something significant to properly disfigure it. So most soldiers aren't necessarily walking around with you can maybe put a scratch in it or something, but a proper disfigurement, you sort of want to either have a good file or a grind wheel or something. And yes, many were defaced at some point. I know that as a fact. I have no good knowledge on whether that's the stuff that was sort of, surrendered through a process versus somebody dies on the battlefield and somebody else comes and collects the gun. It is definitely, the one I have is definitely a war bring back, in the sense it doesn't have late post-war serial numbers. Because if you bring in a gun now into the U.S., it has to have a serial number, yes, but it also has to have the importer's mark. If you're bringing a gun in to then resell, you have to have an importer's mark on it. It can be very small, it can be very discreet, but you have to have it there. If you're bringing it back as an individual, it varies. And part of the problem is it's really hard to bring back a gun as an individual, because you can't normally just get on an airplane with a gun, even with it, internationally, with it locked away. It's possible, and obviously people do it, but it's a lot of paperwork and a lot of difficulty. Normally, you go to a gun dealer, say in France or wherever, and you go, hey, can you ship this to a gun dealer in America? And often in that process, that may get a importer's mark, because you have to ship it through not just any old gun dealer. It has to be shipped through a dealer who has an import-export license for firearms. I know, I used to have one many years ago. And so you have to stamp in or electric pencil in or something a importer's mark. Mine doesn't have that, and I don't know when that starts. I don't know if it was going on the 50s. I know for sure, I don't know, well, for sure, I believe it by the 1970s or something, you have to have that. I don't know the exact time. So I think mine is a wartime bring back. Again, it could be, it could be a soldier stationed in Guam 10 years after the war brings it back from, stuff warehoused on Guam or in the Philippines, I don't know for sure. But it's in pretty good shape, and it's a pretty well developed gun. But we're talking generally about Japanese firearms. And in the days, pre-World War I, when the first Arisakas were developed, they were, fairly cutting edge technology, and they get improved over the time. But by the time World War II rolls around, you're really sort of looking at a World War I style weaponry here. It's for several reasons. One, just that it's bolt action. Yes, the British, yes, the Germans, but the Germans also have, by mid-war, a few 100,000 semi-automatic rifles that they've made, and sort of by late-ish war, they've continued making those and start making assault rifles. So it's not just the U.S. with the M1 Garands, but you also look at the Gewehr 98 versus the Kar 98. The Gewehr 98 is the World War I rifle. The Kar 98K is the World War II. Even though it should be a Gewehr, because it's a rifle and not carbine is something a horse soldier uses. A rifle is something an infantry soldier uses. It would just be it sort of should be called the Gewehr 98K, Kurtz short, and that's sort of what they've lightened up the bolt action rifle. You don't see a lot of that on the Japanese type developments, and their machine guns, because we're talking small arms here. Their machine guns have a lot of influence by Hotchkiss, have a lot of influence by CZ. They use some foreign designs in some of their aircraft, particularly almost straight off foreign designs, as opposed to just being influenced by them. They're never really all that good. They're never really, they're not necessarily bad. They're not like Italian machine guns, but they're just not really the thing. And Japan just, never seems to put that much emphasis on it. They are very, very emphasis on the spirit of attack, as being a thing. And you sort of have to realize, General Stilwell's description of he watched some battle in China, I think in the late 1920s, between warlords, or between the nationalist army and a warlord or something like that, and he gets up pretty close to it. Not that bullets are necessarily whizzing by his head, but he's close enough to observe what's going on, and I'm sure he has binoculars too. But he observes what's going on, and basically, the sort of the side that he was with, observing this thing as American military attaché, or one of them, or whatever, to China. So he's there, and the Chinese troops sort of march up in some sort of formation up near the front, and then just sit down and watch the battle. These are the troops on the front line. They're just sitting there watching. And these aren't obviously the best troops, but what they're watching is sort of the artillery pieces and the machine guns shooting at each other. And if your artillery pieces are destroyed or forced to retreat because the enemy is getting too close to you, your infantry falls back. If the enemy's artillery, or runs out of ammo or whatever, if the enemy's falling back, you advance. The infantry is just sort of there to possess the ground to some degree, and the weapon of decision is artillery and, to a lesser extent, machine guns. Now, I say this, and then I know there's like D-88, which is a German-trained, basically infantry division. They're one of the units you often see, the Chinese late period Chinese nationalists wearing German helmets. That's one of the divisions that the Germans trained. I'm sure they were much better than that. And I'm not trying to downplay. This isn't necessarily or primarily a cultural thing, and that Chinese didn't have aggressive spirit. I think a lot of these guys probably hardly ever fired their weapons. We're probably hardly ever trained on anything. I'm talking about the guys that, sort of march up near the front line in the idea that you're observing it, and they sort of get to a position and sort of, in formation, because the officer doesn't want to lose control of his men is probably also part of it, because getting control back would be a difficulty. Gets them to a position and sits them down. And yeah, we sort of, maybe picturing what I'm saying is that they're like sitting on bleachers watching the battle. Well, it's maybe not quite that. It may be sort of in a low depression, slightly behind a hill, but where they can sort of see the enemy and sort of be seen by the enemy a little bit to know that they're there and the enemy's over there, 500, 5,000, whatever yards away. I don't know the distance for this particular thing, but, that they're out there and they're, and so that they're sort of got up there to the front and observe. And, if you've never fired your weapon, and you may think that's weird, but that could very well be in there because your local commander doesn't have much ammo. And if he only has 20 rounds per soldier, how many rounds is he going to want to have you train with? And he's not sure that he's ever getting more ammo. Now, he might get more ammo, and ammo may show up every couple, 3, 6 months and whatnot, but he's not sure when he's getting more ammo. And so is he going to have you blaze away with your 20 rounds on training? You're probably going to do a lot more close order drill, right turn, right face, left face, forward march, halt, bayonet charges against, wooden dummies and things like that. You're probably going to do a lot more of that than fire off your weapons. And yes, probably most of the well-equipped... Oh, and of course you also have the situation at various times with various warlords. Very much I've seen photographs of soldiers that don't have rifles, that have swords and types of spears or pikes or whatever else. So you don't have universal rifles for your soldiers. So you may have a bunch of soldiers that you have no rifles for. Now, what's the point of those guys? Well, those guys can haul food around. They're labor. And they're also soldiers that if you acquire more weaponry, they can, be turned into more frontline soldiers, but also for controlling peasants. In getting food from the peasants. You show up and you've got a bunch of spears and the peasants don't. You collect your food from the peasants to keep your soldiers moving. That kind of thing. So even the idea of universal rifles is not necessarily going with China. So you have that sort of thing. Okay, so that's... And the Japanese are very well aware of what's going on in China. We can get into some details of that sometime, but they're very well aware. Okay, so now you got the Japanese way of war, and the Japanese had gone through a warring period in which there are sort of constant wars in Japan. Almost to a point that there's always a war going on in Japan, but maybe 80 to 90% of Japan is at peace at any one moment. It's just one daimyo versus another daimyo is having a war off in some province over something. It's not that the country is being torn up and destroyed by a war. It's that there's wars that are being fought. And often the battles are sort of out on battlefields. And they're not scorched earth, often at least, are not scorched earth things. They're not... doing a lot of infrastructural or otherwise damage to it. It's sort of like samurais face off against samurais, and sure, you try to catch the enemy wrong-footed, and so you got twice as many soldiers as the enemy does. It's not like you send out an invitation showing up at, in 10 days on this field with all your soldiers, and I'll show up with all of mine, and then we'll have a good old fight. No, it's, they do maneuver for advantage and whatnot, but they're not necessarily... And I say necessarily because I know in some cases they did raid and whatnot, enemy territory, go in and plunder for food primarily, but other things that value the enemy. But I also, of the peasants and the non-fighting types. But I also know many times that it was basically samurai and the other non-samurai militia type, the Hagugushu? Oh god, I'm messing that up. The non-samurai soldier types were fighting each other, mostly leaving the peasants alone. So I know that both cases happened. I don't know the percentages of it. So they go through this long period of warring, and then you get into the Tokugawa shogunate, and you have the sort of stabilized shogun period that Japan is largely at peace. This is where you get more and more formalized sword fighting. There's still you have a lot of samurai running around, and they still sort of fight each other, but they're much more in the idea of duels amongst each other, and a lot more sort of honor code fighting in battles and whatnot. But you still have this sort of aggressive war fighting idea. And so you have that up until... the Americans show up, and you have the Meiji Restoration. And then you have, you've probably seen the Tom Cruise movie where he pretends to be a samurai and goes off and fights in one of the last sort of... all the samurai who want to defy and stay with the old way go and fight against the modern army and get killed together. Yay! That did happen, though Tom Cruise wasn't there, and I don't think there was any Europeans that decided to go fight alongside the samurai just to go die. But, you know, I don't know. I think I would have heard of it when I was researching stuff like that and reading about that back in the day. So Japan has this very aggressive way of war. And during the first half of the 20th century, starting sort of post-Russo-Japanese War, is sort of pushing out the samurai ethos into the masses a bit more for the masses of, you know, drafted in type soldiers as opposed to a small military class. And so Japan puts a lot of faith in this aggressive war style fighting. And it works very well against the Chinese, and it's very effective. And if you're at all smart about it, very aggressive charging tactics will work. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to have potentially high casualty rates, but I say there's that sort of smart thing. China has lots of machine guns. They are making some. Actually, they're I think in the 30s is when they start making the Maxim machine gun locally, but they're also making copies of other stuff. That manufacture is going on and it's real, but for the scale of China, it's fairly small. There's still importing lots of machine guns as well. So they've got a lot of these machine guns around. And so, yeah, you got to sort of be smart and work around to the flanks, work around to the side. And the Chinese definitely are far from having enough machine guns, you know, to say the American scale of machine guns. So that, yes, if you charge the enemy and you're sort of caught out in the open and there's 2 or 3 Maxims that work over you, you can take very high casualty rates, but still, because there isn't barbed wire and because they're not being stupid and doing World War I tactics of, you know, blowing up the terrain and making it all terrible and then putting barbed wire all over it so that you're moving very slowly as they machine gun you down, you're dashing across it. You will take fairly high casualty rates, but you'll then be in and amongst the machine guns, and the machine gunners and all the rest of the other people start fleeing away. And so, but of course you can also be sort of cagey and have your machine guns fire at their machine guns, your guys sort of laying on the ground and their guys are sort of laying on the ground, and you're moving around and you're taking some casualties, but you figure out where all the, you know, effective enemy are, and then you move a group of soldiers over to the flank somewhere and charge them unexpectedly, and before they can effectively turn their, you know, pick their machine guns up and point them in the other direction, they're on top of you. And this works fairly, like I say, fairly well against the Chinese. It doesn't work very well against the Russians. That's why they don't push against Russia anymore. It doesn't work against the Americans, who have very high firepower rates. Only in the very first, 6 months of 1942 are they still really facing significant numbers of troops that have bolt-action rifles. Those are, you know, in the Philippines, in Wake Island, some of the other early stuff. But they very quickly, the Marine Corps and then the armies that's coming along, they're being equipped with M1 Garands, so they have lots more firepower. The British, their firepower is also pretty good, and they're very steady. And the Malaya campaign, and with primarily Commonwealth troops, the British do very well at stopping the, you know, advance down the road, the sort of, you know, charging or whatever, the aggressive moves down the road at them. You know, they're not running away, they're not being turned aside, they're not, you know, sort of what's going on with the Chinese. And so the Japanese have to go through the jungle and flank them and get around behind and cut them off. And then troops that are surrounded, unless you're really mentally there with it, like being a paratrooper, troops that are surrounded, even if you have enough food and ammunition, you become very concerned. And so this is turning the flanks, but in a, you know, in a fairly significant moving out and around. And the Japanese are much lighter equipped, again going back to this situation, so that they're able to move through jungles that the British can't. And so they perceive the enemy, not that the enemies can't get a platoon through. And it's not that, oh, there's a platoon behind us, or something as they probably at some point think, and then go send a company to deal with it and realize that there's a battalion or two behind them, and you can't just brush them away. So then they have to do fighting retreats and that kind of thing. And they're able to, at least in some cases. I haven't read them about the Malaya campaign in recent times, but I know at least a few cases, that the outpost gets basically surrounded, and then they retreat back as a fighting retreat. They break through the rear, but it takes sort of the turn around and advance in the opposite direction, aggressively, while just holding back. And so even with the British Commonwealth troops, they're able to out firepower, at least in one direction, the Japanese. It's just once they get isolated, it becomes a problem. And so the Japanese never overcome and never understand that they can't. Their spirit of attack can never overcome steady firepower. And they have never built an army that can be highly firepower centric. Twin engine Bombay, there we go. That has advanced, that is good. We're doing machine guns, yes. Let's come down and look at tactics here. We do need to start doing some of these, but okay. Armored unit training, well, we'll see about that, but let's get some artillery and whatnot here improved. And so they're right to be aggressive. They're right to have the idea of, and it goes back to in my reading about the Russian Civil War. For two reasons, both sides did it, but the whites did a little bit more, partly because they often had more cavalry. In the Russian Civil War, they did cavalry charges against machine guns. Well, because this is out in sort of open terrain in Russia, you have fairly long sight lines, and they figured, and I think they're right, that if you dismounted your soldiers and sort of, crawled or leapfrogged forward against the machine guns over the fairly long range, and these are primarily Maxim machine guns in the Russian Civil War that we're talking about here, that you're going to take a fair amount of casualties doing that. And you can sort of imagine, 2,000-3,000 yards, whatever it is, sort of open terrain. They don't have, and this is one of the keys, the enemy doesn't have, or the dug-in guys don't have a lot of barbed wire. They might have some immediate barbed wire right around the sort of machine gun position, but they don't have fields of it. They just, neither side has large volumes of barbed wire to create a large tanglefoot area. So you have these sort of large open areas, and you can sort of do the low crawl and get up to the enemy and shoot at the machine gunners and advance that way. But with the horse, you're able to travel at such a velocity right into the face of the machine guns as they're going firing at you, a bunch of them. You're all just charging in at them so fast that yes, you're going to take casualties, both in horses and in men, but the number of seconds it takes to cross it is very small, and they are then right in amongst those machine guns. And because the second reason they would do this is because they often have sometimes 0 rounds for their guns. Other times they have 5-10 rounds per man. And so if they were to these Cossack forces that were doing this, if they were to try to do this fire and maneuver, they will very quickly run out of ammo. They have enough, it's often, well, they don't have enough ammo, but they often have some ammo that if there's some position they're at, they can, shoot something at the enemy a little bit. But their main is maneuver and charge, and it's over the speed of time. So that if you have a most of China is not considered jungle fighting. But if you have terrain, not like that, but, well, I'm clicking everywhere. But you have terrain that's sort of, this is obviously European terrain, but if you have terrain that is, just a short distance from the tree line to where the enemy is, and you're able to charge and run it, and you have the morale spirit to do that, you're going to take some casualties, but you're going to get in and have a decisive victory. So it works to a point if you don't have too much. The Western allies generally had too much. The Chinese didn't on the firepower scale. Okay, pre-war armor construction has advanced, and I'm guessing that is maxed out. Okay. Still can't get into medium or even light armor designs. Maybe that at 36. I do want to improve those a little bit, but no, we are not going to try to compete with the US on armor. Okay, well, okay, here's another important area that we have yet to really start looking at, but fighter pilot training. We will do that now. We want good fighter. We want to control the air. Now, I don't know how much, sometimes, do you have a light wagon because you have a light horse, so you can't haul a heavy wagon? Or do you have a lightweight horse because you only have a light wagon and you don't need to, you don't need a big heavy oxen or something to tow a light wagon? Now, you might see that as circular arguments, but let's just say that you're in Japan and your wagons are going up and down hills, steep roads a lot, and if you were to make them heavy, moving things up and down hills, even with a fair amount of oxen, may be a bit difficult because of this. And I'm just sort of making this up as I'm going along, as you can probably tell. But if you have a fairly light wagon with a light horse or two, and you don't overload the wagon, those horses may be able to, I'm just BSing about this, but sort of in theory, going up those hills may be much easier and quicker, and you just make more trips in sort of the way the slow oxen or group of oxen towing a heavy wagon. Now, of course, if you have something big, like a big huge tree that you want to make a big huge single piece of timber off, obviously you would want a heavy wagon, or you need a heavy wagon for it, and you're going to do this. But if it's something that is even bricks, say, you load on a few bricks onto this lighter wagon and you make more trips, that may be better than a big wagon making one trip very slowly up the hill. So sometimes maybe you just don't have access to oxen, so even if it would be better, say you're in a flat area, and it would be better to fill up the heavy wagon with lots of bricks and make one trip, but since you don't have any oxen, you build light wagons to deal so that your light horses can pull it quicker. So sometimes, does Japan not have a lot of firepower because it can't make enough ammunition? Oh, well, hey, they should have double or triple the amount of machine guns. Well, again, talking about the Malaya campaign, the amount of kit, as sort of the British like to use the term, sleeping roll, maybe mosquito net, canteen or two, how much food each soldier is carrying, the amount of Okay, let's take a look at this. Oh, okay, no thank you. How much each soldier is carrying? The Commonwealth soldier, I think, was like 2 or 3 times as much weight that he's carrying that the Japanese attackers are carrying in the Malaya campaign. I think it was something like that I read. So that they have a bit of food with them, and it's sort of minimum sustenance rice type food. It's, it's for brief campaigning, enough to eat and keep you going, but maybe not a long-term healthy diet. Enough to give you energy to go through it. And they're carrying very little other stuff with them, which may also mean very little ammo per soldier. A lot of British soldiers, or at least theoretically, are designed within a standard rifle platoon, carry some Bren gun magazines. And I say that is because I'm picturing the pouches. Some of them may be carrying 6 Bren gun magazines per soldier. So they're, which of course, if he wishes to, theoretically, I don't know what the orders would be, but you can strip off the ammo from the Bren gun magazines and run it through your Enfield. But that the idea is you're supposed to have these extra magazines to pass them to the Bren gunner, and the Bren gunner or his assistant or whatever passes you back empty magazines to put back in your pouches. That's sort of the bulky British pouches they see in front of them. Soldiers, those are Bren gun magazines carrying for the Bren gun. Even though they carry a bolt action rifle, he has other ammo on him that is for his Enfield. So he's carrying Bren gun ammo with him. I don't think the standard Japanese soldier is carrying ammo for the platoon or company machine guns. And this is an important element. So if the Japanese soldier, say, carries, I don't know, right off the top of my head, probably things I should look up, if he just carries 60 rounds of ammo for him, where let's say the British soldier is carrying 120 rounds of ammo plus 6 Bren gun magazines. Well, the magazines themselves are going to weigh heavy, but they're what's that, another 180 rounds of ammo on them for the Bren gun, so that they're weighed down with a lot more equipment. So to effectively be able to move, they need to move along a road. Sure, they can get through the rough jungle for a brief distance, but not enough, because they did put out flanking elements when blocking the road, because they didn't want their flanks to be immediately turned. They had to swing sort of wide out into the jungle to get around them. So are the Japanese limiting the amount of ammunition they have because the ammo factories in Japan can only crank out so much ammo? And so if you had a lot more machine guns, just firing that ammo, if your factories can't put out more ammo, then there's no reason to have more machine guns. And the war isn't just the Malaya campaign or the Burma campaign or the one single campaign that you're feeding all the ammo into it. It's a greater wide area. So and to get themselves in a world war, which is their problem. It's one thing to be in a Russo-Japanese war, that you're facing a fraction of the overall Russian army, even though you may be facing all of its navy, but in 2 big chunks, so it's not all at once. And I don't even know if that Japanese Navy, or the Russo-Japanese Navy, even made its own ammo for at least the main guns, because it bought, I think, in the Straits of Tsushima. So I know it had bought some, but I think most of those vessels, maybe not all, had been built in Europe. And for a while, I know they were buying and using Krupp guns in the Russo-Japanese war. The Japanese were doing. So they weren't even building their own heavy field artillery, units way out in the artillery, let alone coastal defense batteries or other things. So they were still importing. Now a gun is a much more complicated thing to make than the ammo that goes in it. But I don't even know, when they start and how much production. It's one thing to produce. Oh yeah, we produce 10 rounds a day, so that means you can fire 10 rounds a day. And now, of course, before the war, you stock up, but once you expend the ammunition. Oh, and I do know that the Japanese ship commanders are constantly reminded not to overuse ammo. for their whether it's the destroyers or the big battleships or whatever. Conserve your ammo, conserve your ammo. They sort of remarkably think that, oh, well, the Americans' first shot, oh, it's long or it's short, and then they adjust, and then they adjust, and they adjust to get on target. Where the Japanese are trained and thought to be on target the first time because you don't have that much ammo on, whether on board your ship or in your whole supply chain system. They're that worried about ammo for their ships. So this makes me think, if you up the amount of firepower each platoon, company, regiment, battalion, division have, more machine guns, more submachine guns, semi-automatic rifles, faster shooting whatevers. If you can't supply, it's one thing to, like I say, to build up for a short war, invasion of Manchuria. Get all, spend 5-10 years building up your ammo supplies, go in, have the war, win, basically go back to peace for 5 or 10 years and build up more ammo supplies. But to have constantly go on a world war or any sort of other thing that uses up, you just may not be able to supply your troops. So there may be no good reason to have better firepower just because industrially they can't do this. That might be the case. Or it might be the case, and I really don't know this, and small arms is different than heavy arm production types. Maybe the case that they just didn't think they needed more ammo production because they were such an aggressive light infantry type format, and I don't know which, and I don't know that anyone really knows this. Now, you may be, no one knows. Well, why would anybody know the answer to this? One, you have to go and look at the Japanese archives. No one alive really today knows the planning levels because anybody who was senior at that time leading up to the war is now long dead. And so if you looked at the way you would have to find this out, you would have to look at, say, 6.5 and 7.7, I believe those are the two main calibers Japan used. Look at their ammo production and look at the factories and try to figure out whether the factories produced what was ordered from the military. And this is not once the war is going hot and heavy. This is pre-war, with the Western Allies. Are they producing just what's ordered, but they have extra ammunition production capacity, meaning they've got enough raw materials and they have enough production machinery and they're chugging out ammo and they get through in, say, 25 days or in 20 days. Let's say in 20 days out of a month, they get done with the month's production total. Or is it the case that they've been ordered to make, let's just say 1 million rounds this month, but they can only turn out 800,000 plus, but not up to 900,000 rounds? That would tell me, is it an ammunition bottleneck? Because we know once you get into total war, you're trying to max everything out, you're trying to expand everything, and everything else is put aside. But and you may be able to grow it, but that takes time. But if you have long-term planning, meaning 3 or 4 years, you sort of know whether it's an ammunition bottleneck or the design thoughts of the Army, what it thinks it needs. Well, on all that, I think we're going to end the episode here. I want to thank you all for watching. Thank you for liking the videos. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. And, of course, please post comments, corrections, questions. Love hearing from you. See you next time for more Hearts of Iron.